1. The abandoned fairground Labor Day was supposed to be a day of celebration, a break from the monotony of everyday life. I'd heard about the old fairground on the outskirts of town, abandoned after a tragic accident that claimed the lives of several children decades ago. Rumors swirled about the place being haunted, but I'd always dismissed them as mere urban legends. However, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to visit. The fairground was easy to find, just off a deserted road, hidden by overgrown trees. The rusted gates creaked ominously as I pushed them open, stepping into a place frozen in time. Once, this would have been a vibrant spot filled with laughter and joy, but now the colors had faded to a bleak, washed-out gray. The rides stood still, their metal frames corroded and brittle, while the wind whispered through the empty stalls. As I walked deeper into the fairground, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the gravel. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just more dilapidated rides and empty space. Then I reached the old carousel. It stood in the center of the fairground, its once bright horses now chipped and faded. Without warning, it started to turn on its own. The faint, eerie sound of carnival music filled the air, distorted and warbling as if it were coming from an old, broken record player. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat, as shadowy figures began to appear on the horses. Their faces were blurred, indistinct, but I could tell they were children. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These were the spirits of the children who had died here all those years ago. Their forms flickered like old film projections, and as the carousel spun faster, the music grew louder and more distorted, almost painful to hear. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, the echo of the music following me as I fled. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys in my desperation to get away. As I drove off, I dared one last glance back at the fairground. The carousel was still spinning, but the figures had vanished. Every Labor Day since, I've been haunted by that ghostly music, a reminder of what I saw that day. I can still hear it sometimes, in the dead of night, as if the spirits are calling me back to that cursed place. 2. The Labor Day Storm. Our Labor Day weekend at the lakeside cabin was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to unwind and escape the pressures of everyday life. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, right by the lake, offering a perfect view of the water. We arrived early, eager to start our vacation, but the weather had other plans. The storm hit suddenly, the sky darkening as thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. We barely had time to secure the windows before the wind started howling, shaking the cabin to its foundation. Rain pelted the roof with such force that it sounded like the cabin might cave in. We huddled inside, the power flickering on and off, casting the room in a strange, strobe-like effect. Then came the banging. At first, we thought it was just the wind, or perhaps a loose shutter flapping against the side of the cabin. But as the storm intensified, so did the banging. It became rhythmic, almost deliberate, echoing through the small space and setting our nerves on edge. My friend decided to check the door, thinking maybe a branch had fallen against it. When he opened it, we were met with a terrifying sight. A man, drenched and pale, standing silently on the porch. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his thin frame, and his eyes were hollow, his skin a sickly blue. He didn't say a word, just stared at us with a dead, vacant gaze that chilled me to the bone. We slammed the door shut, bolting it as the banging resumed, more frantic this time. It echoed through the cabin, coming from all sides now, as if the man, or whatever he was trying to get in from every direction. We huddled together, too scared to sleep, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin. When the storm finally passed in the early hours of the morning, we cautiously opened the door. The man was gone, but wet footprints led away from the porch, disappearing into the forest. We were too shaken to enjoy the rest of our trip, and we left as soon as the roads were clear. Later, we found out that years ago, a man had drowned in the lake during a similar Labor Day storm. His body was never found, and some say his spirit still haunts the area, looking for help that never came. I can't shake the feeling that we saw him that night, his restless soul still trapped in the storm that claimed his life. 3. The last shift. I never minded working the late shift on Labor Day. The office was usually quiet, with most of the staff off enjoying the holiday. It was a chance to catch up on work without the usual interruptions. That night started like any other. Dimly lit hallways, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound as I sat at my desk. Around midnight, I decided to take a break and stretch my legs. As I walked past the conference rooms, I noticed a light flickering in one of them. It was odd because I was sure I was the only one left in the building. Figuring someone had forgotten to turn it off, I headed to the room to switch it off. Inside, the conference room was dimly lit by the flickering overhead light. But what caught my attention was the figure sitting at the head of the table. A man in a suit, his back to me, hunched over a stack of papers. I felt a strange chill as I approached him, the air around him unusually cold. I called out, expecting him to turn around, but he didn't move. As I walked around to face him, my heart nearly stopped. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the papers in front of him, and his skin was ashen, a pallor that screamed death. He looked like he had been sitting there for hours, days even, completely still, as if frozen in time. Panicking, I stumbled out of the room and ran straight to the security desk. The guard looked at me like I was crazy when I told him what I'd seen, but he agreed to check it out. We returned to the conference room, but the man was gone. The chair was still turned out as if someone had just been sitting there, but there was no sign of the man. Shaken, I left the office early that night. The next day, I did some digging and discovered a chilling story. Years ago, an employee had died in that very conference room on Labor Day after suffering a heart attack during a late-night meeting. His body wasn't found until the next morning, slumped over his work just like the figure I had seen. They say his spirit is still there, working late into the night, unaware that he's long since passed away. Since that night, I can't bring myself to stay in the office after dark, especially on Labor Day. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that he's still there, trapped in his final moments, reliving that fateful night over and over again.